Hello and welcome back. I am Lord Revonworc, and this is yet another half-assed, last-minute, creepy month special. So, the past couple of Halloween specials I've talked about works of horror fiction I like, but this year there's been a looming catastrophe that, for the past several months, had been scheduled to strike the world on Halloween, and honestly, I can't really bring myself to pass up the opportunity to talk about this. So, this year's Hello-Ween special is going to be about only the scariest topic there is. Politics. Specifically, today, we're going to talk about Brexit, or watching any country other than my own self-destruct for a change. For those of you who don't know, the word Brexit is a portmanteau of Britain and exit, and refers to the process of the UK leaving the European Union. Let's go back to December 2015. This man is David Cameron. He was the leader of the Conservative Party. The Conservatives held a majority of seats in the House of Commons, and because of that, Dave was also Prime Minister of the UK. Dave, unfortunately, has a nasty gambling habit. His game of choice isn't craps or roulette, but the referendum. See, when Dave became Prime Minister back in 2010, the Labour Party was agitating for a referendum to replace the UK's first-past-the-post electoral system with a proportional alternative vote system. If you don't know what that means, basically it would effectively do away with a two-party system in the UK, which would benefit the country as a whole, but which would effectively keep the Conservatives from ever winning a majority in Parliament again. So Dave couldn't let that happen. But if he prevented it, Labour would use it to argue he was being undemocratic. So he gambled on a referendum, and the country soundly rejected the electoral system change. Not long afterwards, the Scottish National Party, or SNP, a party advocating for Scottish independence, began agitating for a referendum on Scottish independence. Because one of the main goals of the Conservatives is the preservation of the Union, Dave couldn't have that, so he gambled on another referendum, and won again, with voters narrowly rejecting independence, in part because the Scottish enjoyed EU membership, and leaving the UK would have meant leaving the EU. On a side note, this is Nigel Farage. He was a member of the European Parliament and an influential member of the United Kingdom Independence Party, better known as UKIP. UKIP is a far-right British nationalist party. They've been the most vocal voice for Britain leaving the European Union, and Nigel has been the most vocal of UKIP. His populist demagoguery has been key in driving Euroscepticism in the UK. The Conservatives, however, were far from unanimous on their position on the European Union. Many Conservative MPs are Eurosceptic, including the former Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, and a group of Conservative MPs that call themselves the European Research Group, or ERG. However, many Conservatives were pro-EU, Dave included. Dave, being an economically minded fiscal conservative, was more than aware of the many negative effects that would be had from suddenly putting up a ton of trade barriers with your country's single biggest trading partner. It's because of this that Dave, still high on his referendum winning streak, decided to gamble once more. Unfortunately for Dave, this time his gamble didn't pay off. The vote was close, but nowhere near close enough. The British people had decided they wanted to leave the EU, and now the government would have to oblige or be called undemocratic. So what does Dave do? Does he begrudgingly accept the referendum results and help bring the country out of the EU, or does he refuse, insisting that the British public made a mistake and that he knows best? The answer is he quits and leaves the job for someone else to do. That is to say, he resigns in protest as Prime Minister and leader of the Conservatives, leaving the Conservatives to have to pick a new leader and thus new Prime Minister to deal with the mess Dave left behind. The person to win that distinction was a Conservative MP named Theresa May. May originally voted Remain in the referendum, but insisted on carrying out the will of the people and delivering Brexit. She wasn't the only one who felt this way. Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, which was the UK's second largest party, also thought that Brexit should be carried out because it was the will of the people. So Parliament easily passed a movement allowing the Prime Minister to activate Article 50, the EU law that let members leave the EU. May finally did this on the 29th of March, 2017, starting a 2-year countdown, during which she'd have to negotiate a withdrawal agreement with the EU or leave without a deal. Or, she could just extend the leave date, kicking the problem down the road for later, hint hint wink wink. You see, what Brexit actually means is pretty dependent on what the British government can agree with the EU. Now, at the time, there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there about what Brexit would actually mean. I mean, for heaven's sakes, Boris Johnson claimed that leaving the EU would somehow increase funding to the National Health Service. That's a pretty obvious and nonsensical lie. Since then, though, a research paper called Operation Yellowhammer was published by the British government outlining the baseline likely consequences of a no-deal Brexit. So, what is a no-deal Brexit? Well, simply put, it's if the UK leaves without agreeing to anything with the EU beforehand. The no-deal Brexit is about as severe as Brexit can be, and any prospective deal reached would be made for the sole purpose of mitigating the negative consequences of a no-deal. So, here are the actual predictions. Trucks transporting goods through the Channel Tunnel will suddenly see custom delays that will last days. Ports will see permanent disruptions that will significantly reduce trade traffic. Oil refineries will shut down. Fishing vessels will be disallowed from fishing. Prices will rise. Trade overall will drop significantly, leading to mass business closures and food and medicine shortages, which, lead to people dying. And that's not even bringing up the Scottish or Irish issues. As for the Scottish issue, remember when I said that the Scottish independence referendum was defeated because Scots wanted to remain in the EU and leaving the UK would take them out of the EU? Remember when I showed you the Brexit referendum map and Scotland overwhelmingly voted to remain? Well, you can put 2 and 2 together. If a no deal happens, Scotland is almost certain to leave the UK. More serious than that, however, is the Irish issue. This is because of the long and detailed history between Ireland and Great Britain. I'll grossly oversimplify it right now. Suffice it to say, the British have ruled Ireland, at least in part, for nearly a millennium, and never really treated the Irish well. That maltreatment got worse in the 16th century, when the British became Protestant, but the Irish stayed Catholic. And you don't need to know much about European history to know that Catholics and Protestants haven't historically gotten along very well. This eventually led the British to start seizing Irish land and handing it out to British Protestants in an attempt to remake Ireland in Britain's image. The result was, when the Irish began agitating for autonomy and later independence, there were a ton of Irish Protestants vehemently opposed to it because that would mean them being ruled over by Catholics, and they couldn't have that. So Protestant paramilitary forces formed to oppose Irish nationalist paramilitary forces, and Ireland was eventually plunged into a bloody independence war between Irish nationalists, Protestant unionists, and British soldiers. This war ended with the British deciding to give Ireland independence, but not wanting to abandon the Unionists, they decided to partition Ireland. Because how could that possibly go wrong? The answer is that the sectarian violence continued after Irish independence in Northern Ireland, particularly after a border wall was put up between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. This split communities in two and greatly drove further Irish nationalist and anti-British sentiment, culminating in a protracted, decades-long guerrilla war in Northern Ireland that spilled over into Britain, the Republic of Ireland, and continental Europe, known as the Troubles. And yes, that's what they actually called it. The Troubles only ended with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, which, among other things, got rid of the border wall, which was essentially what started the war. But here's the thing. They were only able to do away with the border wall because both Ireland and the UK were in the EU's custom union at the time, which made it so both countries shared custom laws and thus didn't need custom checks on the border. Leave the EU without a deal, and that border wall necessarily has to go back up, which would violate the Good Friday Agreement and restart the war. No one with any sense wants that. In particular, the EU and Ireland are dead set against it. So much so that they won't accept any deal without some solution to the Irish border. And this is where negotiating the deal gets really tricky. So, a no-deal Brexit is a really bad idea, and May knew this all too well. While she wanted to leave the EU, she wouldn't let it happen without a deal on her watch. However, a lot of Conservative MPs were dead set against any kind of deal, particularly the hardcore ERG. So, despite May's majority in Parliament, she wouldn't have enough support to actually pass the deal on Conservative votes alone. This left her with two options. Either work with Jeremy Corbyn, who also wanted to leave with a deal, to negotiate a bipartisan withdrawal agreement with the EU, or hold a general election and hope the Conservatives win enough seats that she can safely ignore the hardliners. She chose option B. It didn't turn out how she had hoped. The Conservatives wound up 4 MPs short of a majority. In order to hang on to power at all, they needed to form a coalition with another party. But not many wanted to cooperate with the Conservatives on Brexit, so they had to settle for teaming up with the Democratic Unionist Party, or the DUP. The DUP is a Northern Irish Unionist party. This means they want Northern Ireland to stay as close to Britain as possible, and they see Brexit as a way to cut Northern Ireland's ties with the rest of Ireland. So they'll help keep the Conservatives in power, but they'll need Brexit to happen their way. So May goes to Brussels to negotiate her deal with the EU. Fast forward to November 2018, May publishes the withdrawal agreement she negotiated with the EU, and the EU endorses it, because of the inclusion of a provision called the Irish backstop. The backstop was May's solution to the Irish border problem. Simply put, when the UK leaves the EU under her deal, the UK remains part of the customs union until such time as an actual solution is found. Initially, the backstop would only include Northern Ireland, creating a hard border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. But the DUP wouldn't have that, so the backstop was stretched over the whole country. Finding such a solution is unlikely to happen anytime in the near future, so the result is, in effect, that the UK would lose its representation in the EU, but it would still remain part of it in every other substantive way. It should come as no surprise that this withdrawal agreement was highly unpopular with Parliament, because no opposition members were invited to the negotiations. The deal was one Labour didn't like. And no Remainers were going to support it because they wanted no Brexit at all. Since several Remainers at the time were Conservatives, May couldn't rely on her own party to pass the bill, and some Conservatives would even wind up leaving the party. The hardline Brexiteers in the ERG also wouldn't back the deal, meaning May couldn't get enough of her own party on board to pass the deal. So the vote gets delayed to January while May tries to get enough MPs on board. But then the vote happens. 202 votes for, 432 against. So she tries again. She spends another 2 months trying to scare no-deal Brexiteers into thinking there won't be a Brexit at all, and scaring Remainers into thinking there'll be a no-deal. The second vote happens. 242 votes for, 391 against, and she sees her solution. If she can just keep putting her deal before Parliament over and over again, she can wear them down until eventually enough people vote for it in order for it to pass. But there's not enough time for that. The deadline is now only days away. To avoid a no deal, she has to ask the EU for an extension. So that's what she does. May initially asks for an extension to June 30th. Why this date? Well, because 2019 was an election year for the EU, and July 1st is when the new European Parliament sits. Member states have to hold European elections before July, so they have MEPs to send to Brussels. If the UK leaves on June 30th, they don't have to hold European elections, which Brexiteers really don't want to do. And it further makes it effectively impossible for them to either stop Brexit or continue extending, meaning Remainers will have to vote for May's deal or its no deal. Europe, however, can see this trick coming a mile away, so they offer a different extension. If they can pass the withdrawal agreement by March 29th, they could extend until May 22nd for implementation. Otherwise, the extension would be until April 12th to find a new solution. So May begrudgingly accepts and holds a third vote for the withdrawal agreement on March 29th. The outcome? 286 for, 344 against. With the new April 12th deadline looming, May tries her deal again before Parliament, but the Speaker of the House refuses to let it be vote on again. Defeated, May has to ask for another extension. She again asks for June 30th, but the EU instead offers her October 31st, insisting that the UK hold EU elections. So they do that, and the EU elections don't go well for the Conservatives. They lose all but 4 of their 19 EU seats. See, turns out, no one really wants a deal. Everyone in the UK seems to either want no deal or no Brexit. And since Theresa May's Conservative Party kept pushing for a deal and doing so unsuccessfully, her popularity has tanked. May has wound up so reviled by her own party, not to mention the opposition, and it's gotten to the point where some MPs are offering to vote for the withdrawal agreement if she resigns. Not enough to pass it, mind you. I was just trying to impress upon how unliked she was at the time. So she resigns as Prime Minister and leader of the Conservatives. Now the Conservatives have to pick a new Prime Minister, and who should throw their hat in the ring but Boris fucking Johnson? He campaigned on a hard Brexit, tapping into his base's no-deal leanings and the fatigue that years of Brexit had brought the country, promising that, if he becomes Prime Minister, he'll take the UK out of the EU on October 31st, deal or no deal. Since he only needs the approval of members of his party, he wins easily. But now he's in a pickle because of Nigel Farage. You remember Nigel, right? Member of UKIP? Well, he's not anymore. See, UKIP brought a bunch of hyper-offensive internet edgelords into the party, hoping to secure the youth vote. Instead, they disgusted the public so much that UKIP lost every seat it held during the EU elections. Nigel, who could see UKIP sinking from a mile away, jumped ship and founded his own party, the Brexit Party. Now, the Brexit Party is basically the same party as UKIP, except without the black hole of self-destruction that is Sargon of Akkad. And the Brexit Party, smelling blood in the water, stood poised to deliver Nigel into more political power than he had previously ever held. Boris had restored the ailing confidence in the Conservative Party, but if the UK didn't leave on October 31st, Boris would have broken his one promise, and the country's Brexiteers in his base would turn towards Nigel to deliver them their no deal. Clock's ticking. Boris needs the UK to leave on Hello-Ween, or else he's not likely to win a general election. But he can't pass May's deal, doesn't have enough time to negotiate a better one, and too much of Parliament is dead set against no deal to let that happen. In order to prevent no deal, Parliament starts trying to pass a bill called the Benn Act, which would force Boris to ask the EU for an extension if Parliament hasn't approved either a deal or no deal by October 19th. Boris can't let that bill pass. So, how does he do that? Simple. He shuts down Parliament. Yeah, that's something the Prime Minister can actually do. This is known as prorogation, and it's something called a prerogative power. That means it's technically something the monarch does, but the monarch in practice lets the Prime Minister decide when to use it. Problem is, he can't just shut down Parliament for months at a time. See, there needs to be a good reason to prorogue Parliament, and typically that reason is the Queen's Speech, an annual parliamentary event equivalent to America's State of the Union speech. If the court thinks he's proroguing to frustrate the will of Parliament, they'll likely rule against it. But a Queen's Speech was coming up in October, shortly after party conference season when Parliament typically closes voluntarily. So maybe if he announces an extended prorogue covering both of those, it'll look normal enough to pass without scrutiny while still leaving not enough time before or after it for Parliament to do anything about Brexit. With Parliament rushing through the Benn Act as fast as possible, however, it's a race against time. It might get passed before the prorogue, and if so, Boris is fucked. So he orders his party members to vote against it. The already dwindling Conservative majority disappears when one MP defects to join the Liberal Democrats. Then, on the same day, a crucial vote occurs. Not the final vote of the bill, but one necessary for it to progress further. Boris tells Conservatives that anyone who doesn't oppose the Benn Act will be kicked out of the party. Most comply, but 21 still vote for it. So Boris kicks them out of the party. In a single day, the Conservative majority evaporates. Without a clear majority backing him anymore, Boris is now vulnerable to a vote of no confidence. If such a vote passes, Boris will be removed as Prime Minister. The opposition knows this is their best chance to get rid of that oaf and save the country from Brexit. There's just one problem. They also have to pick a new Prime Minister. And if they can't within 2 weeks, a general election is triggered, and if a general election happens before October 31st, the Conservatives will likely win, putting Boris back in power. The problem is, the opposition can't decide on a new prime minister. The natural choice would of course be Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party, but the Liberal Democrats and the ex-Conservatives all hate him, and you'd need their support. They'd back a compromise candidate, but Jeremy Corbyn really wants the next prime minister to be Jeremy Corbyn, so he won't back a compromise candidate. So, because the opposition is too busy infighting, they instead leave Boris Johnson in charge. The final vote on the Benn Act is scheduled for September 9th. At this point, Boris can't stop it, so he instead calls for a general election in October. He needs a general election before the 31st, because if he gets it after, he'll have either not left at all yet, or left without a deal. If the former happens, the Brexit Party sinks his campaign. If the latter, then the economy collapses and a war in Northern Ireland starts, and he and the Conservatives get all the blame for it. Either way, Boris loses, so he needs a general election in October. Then he can stay Prime Minister for 5 more years regardless of the Brexit outcome. The opposition knows all this too, and soundly rejected his call for a general election, despite many of them having previously called for one. Desperate, Boris prorogued Parliament on the 9th of September, but the Benn Act passes first. So that's it, isn't it? Boris is lost? Well, yeah, basically. He doesn't give up, though. The Supreme Court eventually rules against prorogation, so Parliament opens back up after 2 weeks, at which point Boris begins a series of harebrained schemes to force a no deal. He continues pushing for an election, to no avail, and tries an overly complicated scheme to trick deal supporters into voting for a no deal, which involves negotiating a new deal with the EU, which he can only manage by making a ton of concessions, and using a loophole in the Benn Act to use the passing of a deal to trigger a no deal. That also doesn't work. At one point, he tries to bribe the dictator of Hungary to reject extensions on the EU side, but to no avail. Come October 19th, he has to send the letter asking for an extension. He said he'd rather be dead in a ditch than extend Brexit any longer, but apparently he finds that outcome preferable to prison, which is where he'll end up if he doesn't send that letter. So he sends it. The EU responds with a 3-month extension. Boris can't turn it down, by law, so he lost. Brexit ain't happening on Hello-Ween. Of course, that doesn't mean it's over. Far from it. Now that the extension's accepted, every party is now looking to a general election as the only way to dig themselves out of this stalemate. Boris still seems to think he can win, even after the extension, and though that's unlikely, honestly, who knows how this whole mess will turn out in the end. Well, that's probably the longest script I've ever written. Too many twists and turns, even with all the details I dropped. I doubt I'll talk about Brexit again next Halloween, though. Unless it gets extended to October 31st again, which, honestly, I could see happening. Sorry to anyone who didn't come here to hear about political nonsense, but I've just found this topic so interesting for a while. But, dear God, this video's long enough already, so I digress. Until next time, I am Lord Revonworc. This has been great, and I will see you all next Hello-Ween.